In the dead of a New York City night, on November 28, 1953, the city's indifferent hum was pierced by a sudden, sickening thud. On the pavement of 7th Avenue, 13 floors below the window of room 1018A at the Statler Hotel, lay the broken body of a man. He was 41-year-old Frank Olson, a brilliant bacteriologist who worked for the U.S. Army's Special Operations Division. The night manager, who had been speaking to Olson on the phone just moments before, heard the crash of glass and the brief, final scream. The police report was swift and conclusive: suicide. A man, likely suffering from a nervous breakdown, had thrown himself from his hotel window. His family was told he had jumped. The case was closed. For 2 decades, that was the official story. A tragedy, yes, but a simple one. A private sorrow for a grieving family. But the story of Frank Olson, like so many stories from that era, was a lie. It was not a simple tragedy. It was the entry point into a labyrinth of paranoia, secrecy, and depravity, a program so dark that its very existence feels like something torn from the pages of a dystopian novel. The truth, when it finally began to surface, was not about a man who jumped, but about a government that pushed. And in doing so, it revealed one of the most terrifying and unethical undertakings in American history. A secret war fought not on battlefields, but inside the minds of its own citizens. This is the story of Project MKUltra, the CIA's obsessive and ultimately monstrous search for total mind control. To understand why a nation that prided itself on freedom would embark on such a path, we must cast ourselves back to the suffocating atmosphere of the early 1950s. The world was cleaved in two, a stark black and white map of ideologies. The Cold War was not a war of open combat between the superpowers, but a war of shadows, of spies, of propaganda, and of paranoia. The United States looked eastward and saw the Soviet Union not just as a military threat, but as an existential one. Stories, both real and exaggerated, were trickling out from behind the Iron Curtain tales of American prisoners of war in Korea, suddenly denouncing their own country, confessing to crimes they couldn't possibly have committed. They spoke in monotone, their eyes vacant. The term brainwashing entered the public lexicon, a terrifying new concept that suggested the very soul of a person could be erased and rewritten. For the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, and particularly for its director, Allen Dulles, this was a nightmare scenario. Dulles was a product of the old world of espionage, a man who believed in fighting fire with a far more ferocious fire. The fear was palpable in the halls of Langley. What if the Soviets had a key? A drug, a technique, a scientific method to unlock and control the human mind? If they possessed such a weapon, they could turn any captured agent, any diplomat, any soldier. They could create assassins who didn't know they were assassins. They could dismantle American democracy from within without firing a single shot. The brainwashing gap, as it was perceived, was as dangerous as the missile gap. And in a war of secrets, the CIA decided it could not afford to be left behind. They had to master this dark art first. This existential fear gave birth to a series of increasingly audacious programs. First came Project Bluebird, later renamed Project Artichoke, which focused on using hypnosis and drugs, particularly sodium pentothal, the so-called truth serum, to enhance interrogations. But these were just the prelude. In April of 1953, with Dulles's fervent approval, the CIA authorized its most ambitious and unrestrained program yet. It was given the cryptonym MKUltra. The MK was a designation for the technical services staff, the CIA's very own Q branch, responsible for gadgets, poisons, and all manner of clandestine technology. The Ultra signified that this was the most secret, most important project of them all. The man chosen to lead this descent into the abyss was a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. If you were to cast a villain for a spy thriller, you would not have cast Gottlieb. He was a mild-mannered man with a clubfoot and a penchant for folk dancing and raising goats at his rural home. But beneath this unassuming exterior was a brilliant, obsessive, and morally flexible mind. Gottlieb was the CIA's master chemist, a man who saw the human brain as just another biological system to be hacked and manipulated. He was tasked with an almost mythical quest to find a way to control the mind. And to do it, he was given an extraordinary degree of freedom. He was allocated 6% of the entire CIA budget, with no oversight and no need to file the usual paperwork. He was, for all intents and purposes, a king in his own secret kingdom, accountable to no one but Alan Dulles. The official charter of Project MKUltra was to investigate the research and development of chemical, biological, and radiological materials capable of employment in clandestine operations to control human behavior. It was an umbrella for 149 distinct sub-projects, farmed out to over 80 institutions. Universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies became unwitting, and sometimes witting, partners in Gottlieb's grand experiment. The program's compartmentalized nature was its greatest protection. A researcher at a university studying the effects of a certain drug on memory might have no idea that their work was being funded by the CIA as part of a larger quest for mind control. At the heart of Gottlieb's early obsession was a single, revolutionary substance, lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD. Discovered by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann in 1943, LSD was a chemical of astonishing power. It could shatter perception, dissolve the ego, and plunge the user into a world of terrifying hallucinations or transcendent bliss. To Gottlieb, it was not a tool for spiritual exploration, it was a weapon. He believed that by first chemically destroying a person's mind with LSD, he could then rebuild it in a new image. He could create a blank slate. The CIA purchased the entire world's supply of LSD from Sandoz laboratories in Switzerland, costing them $250,000. And then, Gottlieb and his team began one of the most widespread and reckless series of non-consensual CIA experiments in modern history. They started with their own. Agents were dosed, often without warning. One agent described being given LSD in his morning coffee and spending the rest of the day convinced that the cars on the streets of Washington were transforming into monstrous beasts. The goal was to see if they could condition themselves against the drug, but the result was often just chaos and terror. But dosing their own was only the beginning. Soon, MKUltra turned its gaze outward, to the American public. They needed human guinea pigs, and they sought them in places where people had no power to refuse. They went to prisons, dosing inmates with LSD and other drugs, promising them reduced sentences for their cooperation. They went to mental hospitals, preying on the most vulnerable individuals, people already struggling with their grip on reality. One of the most horrifying sub-projects took place at the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, which was nominally a facility to treat drug addicts. There, the CIA, in exchange for a steady supply of heroin, was given access to a captive population of African-American inmates to test LSD on. The subjects were told they were participating in a medical study. They had no idea they were pawns in a Cold War secret. Perhaps the most infamous of these operations was Subproject 68, better known as Operation Midnight Climax. This was Sidney Gottlieb's vision brought to life in its most sordid form. In New York's Greenwich Village and on Telegraph Hill in San Francisco, the CIA set up safe houses that were, in reality, brothels. Prostitutes on the CIA payroll were instructed to lure unsuspecting men back to these apartments. Once there, the Mont Johns would have their drinks spiked with LSD. Unbeknownst to them, on the other side of a two-way mirror, a CIA agent would be sitting on a portable toilet with a notepad and a martini, clinically observing the effects of the drug. They were studying how LSD affected behavior, how it might loosen tongues, or if it could be used to discredit someone. The logs from these sessions are chilling in their banality. They record men becoming paranoid, terrified, or violently ill. They document psychological breakdowns in real time. These weren't soldiers or spies. They were ordinary citizen postmen, clerks, tourists who had the simple misfortune of choosing the wrong place on the wrong night. Their lives were treated as disposable data points. The program ran for nearly a decade. We will never know how many people were dosed in those apartments, or what long-term psychological damage was inflicted upon them. They walked out of those safe houses back into their lives, carrying a trauma they could never explain, a secret they didn't even know they were a part of. While Operation Midnight Climax was plumbing the depths of cynical exploitation, another, even more monstrous chapter of MKUltra was unfolding north of the border. This brings us to a man named Dr. Ewan Cameron, a respected psychiatrist and, at one point, the president of the American Psychiatric Association. From his base at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Dr. Cameron was pioneering a set of radical techniques he called psychic driving and de-patterning. His theory was that to cure mental illness, one had to first completely erase the patient's existing personality. The CIA, through a front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, saw immense potential in Cameron's work and began funding him generously. Patients came to the Allen Memorial Institute for common ailments, anxiety, postpartum depression, even marital troubles. They had no idea they were about to become subjects in a brutal experiment. Cameron's de-patterning involved subjecting patients to massive, medically unjustifiable doses of electroconvulsive therapy, sometimes 30 to 40 times the normal therapeutic amount. This was followed by putting them into drug-induced comas for weeks or even months at a time. While they were unconscious, the psychic driving began. For hours, days, and weeks on end, a speaker placed under their pillow would play a looped message. It could be a simple, negative statement like, "You are a bad mother," or a series of random noises. The goal was to break down all mental resistance, to wipe the slate clean. The results were catastrophic. Patients emerged from these treatments as hollowed-out versions of their former selves. Their memories were gone. Their skills were gone. Adults were reduced to an infantile state, unable to control their bladders, needing to be retaught how to speak, how to read, how to use a fork. They were not cured. Their minds had been shattered. Dr. Cameron never managed to repattern anyone. All he succeeded in doing was destroying them. For the CIA, this was a failure, but an informative one. They had learned how to break a mind, even if they hadn't learned how to rebuild it. The search for the perfect mind control tool wasn't limited to LSD or psychological torture. The MKUltra portfolio was terrifyingly diverse. Gottlieb and his team investigated hypnosis, trying to create hypnotic couriers who could carry secrets they were unaware of. They explored sensory deprivation, subliminal messaging, and paranormal phenomena. They studied a vast pharmacopoeia of toxins and drugs, from psilocybin and mescaline to more obscure compounds, always searching for the magic bullet. They even drafted a manual on assassination, detailing methods for making a murder look like an accident, a skill that brings us back to that hotel room in New York City. Frank Olson was not just any scientist. He was an expert in bioweapons, deeply embedded in the CIA's most secret programs. He had worked with Sidney Gottlieb. He had witnessed things. He had been to Germany and seen brutal CIA interrogations firsthand. He had developed doubts. His colleagues noted that he had become morose, questioning the morality of their work. To the paranoid mindset of the agency, a man with that much knowledge and a budding conscience was a liability. 9 days before his death, Olson and a group of his colleagues went on a retreat to a remote cabin at Deep Creek Lake, Maryland. There, Sidney Gottlieb decided to conduct an impromptu experiment. Without their knowledge or consent, he spiked the Cointreau liqueur with LSD. For the next few days, Olson's mental state deteriorated rapidly. He became paranoid and deeply agitated. He wanted to quit his job. The CIA, instead of getting him proper medical help, took him to New York to be assessed by a doctor who was also on their payroll and involved in MKUltra hypnosis experiments. He was checked into the Statler Hotel with a CIA handler. And then he fell. The official story held for 22 years. But in 1975, in the wake of post-Watergate investigations into intelligence agency abuses, the truth began to emerge. The Rockefeller Commission, set up by President Ford to investigate the CIA, stumbled upon the Olson case. The family was informed that Frank had not simply committed suicide. He had been given LSD without his knowledge. The government offered a settlement and a private apology from the president. It seemed once again like the case was closed. But the Olsen family, led by Frank's sons Eric and Nils, were not satisfied. They knew there was more to the story. In 1994, they had their father's body exhumed for a second autopsy. The forensic pathologist, Dr. James Starrs, came to a shocking conclusion. The pattern of injuries on Olsen's body was not consistent with a suicidal jump. Instead, he found evidence of a blow to the head that occurred before the fall. His report concluded that the evidence was rankly and starkly suggestive of homicide. The man on the pavement wasn't a suicide. He was most likely a victim. A man who knew too much, who was starting to talk, and who was permanently silenced. The unraveling of Frank Olsen's secret was part of a much larger unraveling. The real end of MKUltra began not in a lab, but in an office. In 1973, as the Watergate scandal was consuming Washington, the then CIA Director Richard Helms knew that investigations into government secrecy were coming. He gave a single, fateful order: destroy all records related to Project MKUltra. Crate after crate of documents, the entire history of this dark chapter, was shredded and incinerated. It was a near-perfect cover-up. Helms believed he had buried the program forever. He was wrong. In 1974, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh of the New York Times published a bombshell report detailing illegal CIA spying on American citizens. This blew the doors open. The public was outraged. Congress, feeling emboldened, launched its own, far more thorough investigations. The most famous of these was the Church Committee, led by Senator Frank Church. The committee's investigators were faced with a daunting task. The files were gone, but Helms and Gottlieb had made one critical mistake. While the operational files were destroyed, a box of financial records had been misfiled and survived. It was the smoking gun. These financial documents, some 8,000 pages of them, detailed payments to all the universities, the hospitals, the doctors, and the front organizations. By following the money, the Church Committee was able to slowly, painstakingly piece together a partial mosaic of the program's vast and terrifying scope. They uncovered the Montreal experiments, Operation Midnight Climax, and the non-consensual drug tests. They brought Sidney Gottlieb and his former colleagues to testify in televised hearings. The testimony was a masterclass in obfuscation. Gottlieb, now retired and running a leper hospital in India, claimed he couldn't recall specific details. He and others defended their work as a necessary evil in the fight against communism. But the surviving declassified documents and the testimony of the few victims who came forward painted a different picture. It was a picture of unchecked power, of scientific hubris, and of a profound contempt for human life and dignity. So what, in the end, did MKUltra accomplish? After 2 decades of research, hundreds of millions of dollars, and a human cost that can never be fully calculated, the CIA failed in its primary mission. They never found a truth serum. They never created a Manchurian candidate, assassin who could be triggered by a code word. They never mastered mind control. All they mastered was the art of destruction. They destroyed lives, families, and careers. They destroyed the minds of countless vulnerable people whose names we will never know. And they destroyed a significant piece of America's moral credibility. The legacy of Project MKUltra is long and dark. It fueled a generation of deep-seated distrust in the government that persists to this day. When people talk about conspiracy theories involving secret government programs, MKUltra is the Exhibit A that proves that sometimes the most paranoid fantasies can be terrifyingly real. It forced a reckoning in the medical and scientific communities, leading to stricter regulations on human experimentation and the concept of informed consent. But the most haunting legacy is the silence. Because Richard Helms's order to destroy the files was so successful, we are left with a story full of holes. We know about Dr. Cameron's work because the Canadian government eventually compensated his victims. We know about Frank Olsen because his family never gave up. But who are the others? How many men were lured back to those safe houses and left with permanent psychological scars? How many prisoners and patients were used as lab rats and then forgotten? How many other Frank Olsons were there, whose deaths were conveniently labeled as accidents or suicides? We will never know. Their stories were turned to ash and smoke in a CIA incinerator. The story of MKUltra is a chilling reminder that the institutions designed to protect us can, in the name of that very protection, become the greatest threat. It's a testament to what happens when fear is allowed to override ethics, when secrecy is allowed to fester without oversight, and when human beings are reduced to mere instruments in a grand ideological struggle. The shadow of Sidney Gottlieb's quest for the ultimate weapon, a weapon to conquer the human soul, still hangs over us. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. What other secrets, buried in misfiled boxes or long since destroyed documents, are still waiting to be brought into the light? The darkness of these Cold War secrets is vast, and we have only illuminated one small corner of it tonight. If you find these deep dives into the hidden chapters of our past compelling, and believe that understanding these stories is crucial to preventing them from happening again, consider subscribing to the channel and joining our community of historical investigators. And I want to hear from you. What forgotten story, what historical mystery do you believe needs to be told next? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for listening.